Welcome to this session of the economics of game design. As most of you are game developers or game developers moving into the Web3 space, you know that game economics is really hard. Game design on its own is really quite a challenge. And as we talk about the economics of the games, as we talk about planning and designing the economics, it really gets very complicated. And so this is what we want to talk about today. Why are we here today? I want to talk about three things. Economics is the most important thing to get right in your economy. You know this as well. When we're building a game, we're really building a brand new economy. We're designing everything from scratch. What does that mean? It means that we are designing what the rules of transactions are. We're designing the allocation of resources. We're designing what resources are available. What can people do with these resources? These are all economics. Economics is not just about money. It's not just about supply and demand. It's all these little bits and pieces coming together to form an economy in which agents, users, players can come together and engage. At the end of the day, economics is a means to an end. What is the end we're talking about? The end is gameplay. Whether with incentives, with rewards, with monetary returns, we want people to play the game. We want people to love the game. We want people to engage in the game. And we can use economics to help incentivize these outcomes, these behaviors. But how do we get it done? How do we get there? How do we even get started? Because this is what we want to talk about. So why is this so important? We talk about how gameplay is important. Game economics is also very important. And why is this so important? Because game economics is the backbone of your entire market. It's very complicated to get right, and this is something that we want to nail down. Lastly, we wrote a report talking about what the gameplay research looks like. Thirdly, we wrote about how to design game economy, and so we want to share it with you and share the framework and processes. So the objective of this session today is for you to understand why markets exist and why should we even care about economics. Then I want to share a bit more of the game economics framework and jump into a little case study of Axie Infinity, which is a very interesting situation to be in right now, because what we experience in Axie Infinity is a financial crash, a market crash, a recession. And for better or for worse, we're seeing a lot of such trends happening in the crypto space or in the financial market today. So this helps to give, good analogy and good understanding of what's going on in the space right now. And as designers, as developers, what should we take into consideration when we're designing these economies? So, markets. Why do markets exist? Well, markets provide value. What kind of value are we talking about? Because you can go to the grocery shop or go to the farmer's market and there's value there. Well, the main value that markets bring is to allow for transactions. And when they provide and create value when they reduce transaction cost. What does that mean? We talk about reducing transaction cost, you talk about matching being done right. So a buyer and seller coming together and they both agree on something and they trade based on the quantity or the price they're talking about, and that matching is done right. That's a big value add of markets. This value is then realized when there is a reduced cost to search for the right kind of partner. So say I want to buy fresh tomatoes and I want to buy very specific kind of Italian tomatoes, and the farmer's market might not have that, and I need to go out and go to each individual house and ask, do you have the Italian tomatoes that I can buy? However, if a market comes together and a market consolidates all the tomatoes together, then it adds a lot of value because it reduces my search cost, which is the opportunity cost to trade, and that is a value creation. And lastly, how is value retained? Because you need to create, you need to realize, and then you need to retain it, you need to keep it. Otherwise, once the market crashes, the value will just poof and disappear. That's not what we want. So the value is retained when the market rules are defined and respected. And you see this difference quite obviously when you talk about some economies and some societies where contract law is followed and some societies where contract law is not followed. Usually we see that in a bit more emerging developing nations, where sometimes contract law is not that important or it's not that followed. So when these market contract laws or these contracts, they set the rules of engagement. But if the rules are defined but not respected, not followed, then it's very hard to retain that value, because once the agreement makes no sense when one of the parties says, I don't follow this, I don't believe in these rules are created by you and I don't believe it, I don't respect it, then the value is gone. So markets exist to add value to the users in the market by reducing transaction cost. We want to reduce transaction cost. So markets tap into the economics of consolidation of the macro space, and it brings more value by increasing the ability to match and transact and define the economic rules of trade, hence contract law, and reduce the opportunity cost to find the right agents to trade with them. So these are markets that we talk about, these are markets that we create, these are the markets that we understand. How does that make sense in the game space? Well, in the big game that we're talking about, we are building a brand new market. We're building a universe, we're building a metaverse, we're building a game economy, a game universe. And when we talk about these game universes, we have to understand who is in this universe that we need to think about, we need to design the rules for, and what kind of activities that they will engage in, so that we can design the right kind of rules to allow these activities to exist. So there are some activities or some rules that we define by the participants, which is completely fine. Sometimes we call it UGC, or in the real physical world, it's like entrepreneurship, where you create and design your own products and solutions, and you create the rules around that. But taking a step back, in general, there are rules in place. In the physical world, there is physics. Gravity is gravity. Gravity is a rule, at least in this dimension that we're talking about and living in. When you fall downwards. So this is a base rule that exists to allow us to do all sorts of things that we want to make in the world. You want to run, you want to jump, you want to drive a car, you want to cycle. These all exist because gravity exists. So what we want to do in building the economics is, what is the digital version of gravity? Gravity exists in the physical world. Gravity does not need to exist in the digital world. What do I mean by that? I mean, in the digital world, you might not need gravity. Or gravity might be of a different strength, or gravity might look differently in the digital world, in the world that you want to create. So gravity is just a rule to constrain our activities. And in the digital world, economics are your Newtonian physics. They are the rules that we want to create to constrain activities so that people can trade and interact harmoniously within your ecosystem. So how do we do that? How can we even get started? It sounds like a very big project. Great question. That's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about the design framework, or the economics framework, to design the metaverse. This is the starting point of how you can design your economy. We always start with 3 pillars. 3 core design pillars: market design, mechanism design, and token design. And why do we start with a framework? Why do we start with pillars? I've been in this space for many years, since 2017, doing a lot of research. And I started off in the space looking at, okay, what if we have a solution, a model that fits everything? And that would be perfect. 1 + 1 is 2. If we're designing everything anyway, why don't we make a rule called 1 + 1 = 2? We use math to beautifully constrain our activities, and we can standardize how systems are built. Turns out, after 2 years of research, it doesn't exist. There is no solution that fits all purposes, all agent types, all priorities in the economy, and all objectives in the economy. However, as much as we do not have a model, we can build frameworks around that. Frameworks are these different constraints, these activities, these design pillars that we have to start thinking about. We think from that perspective when we are building the right kind of model. Frameworks are also very versatile for us to use, because we can adapt them to the kind of outcomes and objectives we're looking for. So, We created a framework that looks at 3 different pillars to share how the economics can make sense and how to begin designing these economic mechanisms. Market, mechanism, and token design. In market design, we are looking at understanding what are the parameters in the market, what defines the market, what is in the market, and how do we parameterize the market. Going back to the analogy of gravity. The market of gravity is Earth. Once you get out of Earth, once you go to the moon, once you go to space, gravity is behaving quite differently. Either there's low gravity or no gravity. So, because of that, when we are designing markets, when we are designing our system, we need to define and constrain the market. So, that is the market design. When we look at DeFi, which is where this entire framework started, we look at market thickness, reducing congestion, safety, and ease of use. When it comes to the metaverse or game space, same concept, we don't deviate too far from the concept. The first principles remain the same, in which markets are the parameters that we want to customize as game developers, game designers. Within these parameters, what do we think about? We think about UGC, user-generated content. We think about NFTs and in-game usability. And we think about value creation. What is value creation? Value creation is when 2 agents come together to interact with each other and create value. So these are economic transactions where they interact, and we need to provide a market, a space, an environment for them to interact and constrain any bad activities. So that's where market design comes in. The second pillar is mechanism design. Everything we talked about so far is defining the market, designing the market, and a lot of rules in the space. So this is exactly what mechanism design does. First, we talk about market design constraining the macro things. Now we move deeper into the economy and deeper into the market, and we look at mechanism design. Mechanism design are the rules that for users to interact within the ecosystem. These are rules that people have to abide by. These are rules that is embedded within the system. Can there be rules that's not embedded within the system? Of course, governance rules. Some governance rules are embedded within the system. Some governance rules are dynamic, like your DAO, how DAO is being voted, how delegates votes are being casted. All these things, these are malleable. But there are also certain kind of fixed structure. For example, before you approve of any treasury expenditure or your different grants given by the protocol or given by the game to incentivize UGC, then there must be a process to go through. These are rules of the game, for example. So in the DeFi space, we look at governance, market structure, and incentives. So how does governance look like? What is the legislative process? What is the executive process? Market structure. What kind of market structure is available? What does pricing structure looks like? Bargaining structure, discussion, negotiation structure. Incentives, financial incentives, non-financial incentives to embed and to incentivize the behaviors through the rules in place. On the flip side, when it comes to the metaverse and game economies, we look at governance. Again, governance very important. Then we look at revenue model. So if you come from the Web 2 game space, free-to-play is quite a common game revenue mechanism. And so looking at a free-to-play perspective, then you have to understand and think about revenue models, cash flows, how does that look like, how does it impact everyone, what kind of rules need to be embedded within such free-to-play systems. So we think about revenue model. And lastly, we think about network effects. And network effects is really interesting in mechanism design because network effects is something that the system can't control, but the system can encourage and incentivize certain kind of network behaviors and to create stickiness with the different user types. And lastly, token design. So if you come from the Web 2 game space, market design and mechanism design is not that different from what you have in the game space. So it's taking the first principles and applying it to gamify the metaverse. Great stuff. Not much learning curve, transferable skill sets, fantastic. When it comes to token design, there is a slight difference. And the slight difference is the opportunity cost of holding a token. What does that mean? In the Web 2 space, in the Web 2 game space, say you want some sword, or you want some skins, or you want different kind of virtual asset, and you can use it, you can sell it, you can exchange it, you can go to the marketplace within the system. So if a nice gun in Counter-Strike, or you get different kind of skins in different games, and you can sell them in the marketplace within the system, and if there's no buyer, then well, too bad, your liquidity is just whatever, how big the game market is. Today, in the Web3 space, that changes things quite a bit, because these assets are fungible, these assets are very liquid, these assets are interchangeable beyond just the game itself. That means any assets that you can generate, capture, or mine, you can sell them immediately in the secondary market that can be bought by people that it's not within the game system. It could be speculators, investors, collectors, or other people trying to enter the game. You can just sell it to them. So what does that mean? It means, going back to opportunity cost, it means that when you're developing tokens in your system, tokens that allow for ease of liquidation, the most important thing to balance is short-term value acceptance, or short-term market value, versus the expected value of the long-term value accrual of holding this token. What does that mean? You hold the token, and if you have a token, you can do two things. The first one that you hold the token, you keep it, and you allow the token to generate value in the long run, because you believe that there is a long-term value generated through whatever utility in place that gives you returns in the long run. So if you have a token, then you hold them. If you have a token, you can do two things. You can hold them and keep them in the long run, because you believe that in the long run it will generate returns, a lot more value add to you by holding it. Alternatively, you can liquidate it right now, take say USD, and spend the USD somewhere, because that USD expenditure gives you more value in the long run than holding that token in the long run. So this becomes a very, very crucial thing for game designers, game developers, economists to think about. When you create any token in the space, when you design any token, it needs to have long-term value accrual, it needs to have long-term utility, it needs to have positive expected value in the long run. Otherwise, people are just going to dump the tokens and liquidate it for USD and use it somewhere else. So, token design, what do we look at? The token is a way to capture value generated by the system. So, how the value is interacting within your game or within your ecosystem will affect the in-game assets. Tokens are the in-game assets. They could be NFTs, or they could be fungible tokens, or they could be currencies. In the DeFi space, we look at token policy, like monetary policy, and it's more token specific. We look at financial incentives, so your APYs, your APRs, your different kind of return profiles, because these are financial assets, and your architecture. So the different kind of mathematic models, especially when you're doing derivatives, the different architecture that defines the token itself. In the game world, in the metaverse world, we're primarily looking at monetary policy. So these three pillars are always important. Depending on the game, some components in market design, mechanism design, and/or token design can be less relevant or more relevant than others. So to summarize, market design, mechanism design, token design. Market design, these parameters are highly customized by the game designer and game developer. We look at UGC, user-generated content, NFTs and in-game usability, as well as value creation. In mechanism design, we're defining the rules for users to interact with the entire ecosystem or with each other. We look at governance, revenue model, and network effects. And lastly, token design. Here we look at how the value interaction is being done within the system, and how does it affect the in-game assets. Primarily, we're looking at monetary policy. So, we talk a lot about value and value and value. What is value? What is value creation? What is the value creation cycle? Value creation cycle consists of three components: creation, hence inflation; distribution, allocation; and sinks, deflation. When new resources are created, or when new value is created, the resources can be deployed to a specific persona, a specific agent, for new economic activities like cashing out or investing in the game, or other personas like people entering the game, interacting with other assets like NFTs or tokens. Okay, what does that mean? So, three things. Value creation cycle: creation, distribution, sinks. So, the best analogy is having pizza. Creation is increasing the size of pizza. Distribution is cutting the pizza into more slices. And sinks is consuming the pizza. So a lot of projects, they focus very much on the creation and distribution side, increasing the size of pizza and cutting the slice of pizza. And value sinks, the real consumption, is actually really important to create a healthy and balanced economy. You can keep growing the pizza, you can keep slicing them out, but at the end of the day, if each individual only has a very tiny slice of pizza, then that is not a healthy economy. You're not going to sustain a healthy person growing up. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure that this is an ongoing process. This is something that continuously exists. It's a cycle. So we grow the pizza slice, we cut them, and then we consume them. Then we continue to grow them, cut them, consume them. It is an ongoing thing. I know when we talk about economics, you always think about, long run, equilibrium, supply demand, that equilibrium point. I agree with you. And in the long run, that's what will happen. In the long run, that's also where we're all dead. So what's important as a game designer, as a game economist, is to balance and maintain that balance. So we can create these systems, then we need to have all these different parameters to balance, to create this sustainable and healthy system. And the best way to balance, the best way to get started with balancing, is defining your value creation, which is increasing the size of pizza. As long as we're always creating value, we're creating real value, you can keep slicing the pizza up, you can keep consuming the pizza. And when people think of value creation, they just think of token inflation. And I understand that, because token inflation is a proxy to value creation. But you can also have a lot of situations where you are increasing your tokens without any real value created. So that is something to be mindful about. So let's talk about the value cycle. The value cycle components represent the various kind of mechanisms in the economy. Every value cycle is very different. Think of value cycle as your GDD, your game development document. You have value creation every time your users interact with each other. And once you map this entire thing up, you map your entire system out, then understand how value is generated at each instance that users are interacting. And from there, this is our starting point. This is our value creation part. We understand how value is created. As we follow this systems map and understand how each agent comes into play, how each agent consumes and is being distributed the value, then we can understand how the economics of these tokens and these value creation in place. And we look at value sinks of realizing their value generated. So moving forward, we're going to see how do we apply that to Axie, where we can see where the economic focus should be, hence value creation, and how it should be moving forward. Again, when it comes to value creation, it's the most important thing is value creation. Sometimes we might miss some things, or we might forget to balance the value creation, distribution, and sinks. And it's okay. It's okay to forget that sometimes. It's important to remember it when we forget and come back to balance and create this healthy, balanced economy. It's what people forget all the time. It's so easy to live in a booming era and forget that you need to realize that value and then go through the booming cycle again. With that, let's jump into Axie Infinity, a case study. So we want to apply everything that we have discussed to Axie and understand how that has affected and understand the economy from this perspective. So the first thing that we do in the entire framework, we talk about market design, and market design talks about the parameters of this market. At the same time, we need to understand who is in the market, right? So we usually look at the various kind of personas in the market, and we look at 5 key personas: players, builders, developers, investors, NFT asset collectors. So from the personas, we're able to understand how each of them creates value, the incentives required to drive the economic activity of value creation, and the resources or tools available to enable that. So we start off with players. These players are the scholarship. And scholars take up 65% of user base. That means these people do not own anything. These people are there almost like as a hourly wage worker who works and plays game as a job and generate returns so that they can sell that amount or sell the asset, the token, for dollars to spend in their country. Then we have builders. So right now there's this thing called Project K in Axie Infinity, in which you have a lot of different land available. So they sell land, and with the land you can create a lot of things. So you're building on top of the Axie game. We have developers. These developers are the core group of people who are continuously improving Axie the game. We have investors. These are typically sponsors. So with scholarship, and people need to sponsor the scholarship. And there's about 2.35 million who own Axie, although I would say numbers has probably dropped because of the recent market movement. And you've got the Axie collectors. These people collect Axie, the NFT, the cute little monster. So let's classify Axie's game into the framework to understand the design of the economy. How do we do that? By market design, mechanism design, token design. In market design, let's look at UGC. So Axie, for UGC, there is the key UGC right now is the Axie breeding program. So Axies are these little monsters and little creatures that they can go to battles with in the Axie game. So breeding is where you've got 2 of these little creatures. You pay SLP and AXS to create a new monster, and you can either sell this monster or use this monster to go in new battles. So this is what a lot of people have been doing, and it's UGC because that's how you increase the supply of these little creatures in the space. Second, value creation. Here, in value creation, you've got PvP, so player versus player, or player versus environment gameplay. And playing any of those allows you to earn SLP, which is their in-game currency, and EXP, experience points. SLP and AXS are 2 currencies that they have in the system, and people can trade them and use them. EXP, the experience points, you can't trade them, it's tied to the specific character. When it comes to in-game usability within the market design, there's a limit on the amount of energy each account can hold, which is a measure of economic activities. If you do a lot of economic activities, you have a lot of energy, and there's only a limit of the amount of energy you can hold, because the energy will determine the allocation of SLP or EXP that you have. And then one interesting thing is that in the market, they have defined a rule saying that for you to engage any game, you need to hold at least 3 Axies, 3 of these creatures. Then they also have land. Land is a project that they just launched beginning of the year, where people can buy land, build on top of land, and do more UGC. So that's market that constrains our economy, our market, our activities, and the rules, the general rules of how you engage the market. The second thing is mechanism design. So mechanism design here, they have a pay-to-win system, where you can purchase high quality Axies with a higher probability of winning in the battle arena. So you can do that, you can pay to win. You can also play to earn, where you can earn SLP, the currency tokens, via PvP and PvE to upgrade your Axie's skills, your little creatures' skills, and you can get more SLP and AXS in the space. Then we also have network effects. So network effects are the sponsors and scholars relationship to reduce barriers to entry. So we want to increase the number of users in the space, we want to increase the network, and there's a high barrier to entry because these Axies, these little creatures, were very expensive at one point of time. So they created this scholars model where people can fund the little creatures and get a profit of revenue from them playing. Then we also have landowners and future scholars and players to help generate more value. Then lastly, for the PvP, you have skills matching system to match PvP, to allow for PvP matches so that it's a strong Axie versus a strong Axie, not a strong Axie versus a weak Axie. And lastly, for token design, here we're looking at the minimum, there's a breeding and utilization rate of Axies. Axies are the creatures. So the number of Axies will be at least 3 times the user base, because if each user needs 3 Axies to enter a battle, then the minimum number of Axies available in the market as circulating supply should be 3 times the user base. And we also understand that breeding is an inflationary pressure. That's the only way you can increase the amount of Axies in the space. You need to allow the Axies to breed. There's also a limit to how many times you can breed, which is 7. This is a rule in the Axie game, a rule in the Axie creature as well, that you have 7 breeding opportunities before it's not usable for inflationary purposes, which means you can't breed anymore. There are 4 key tokens that I would say. Again, tokens do not only mean things that are tradable, tokens can just mean the asset. So with SLP, this is daily inflation based on tasks and gameplay. It's an in-game currency. We have AXS, this is our governance tokens. Fixed inflation and utility based on staking to earn more AXS, and you can spend AXS to breed your Axies. We have energy or EXP. So these are parameters that you can change to affect the inflation rate of SLPs. These are not tradable. And lastly, you have land. This is an NFT. It's a future it's an asset that will increasingly come into the space to allow for trade and to allow for value creation. So what does the value cycle look like? Internally, Axie needs to focus on the balance between user growth and inflationary asset pressures. Remember, every time there's huge user growth, there's 3 times the inflationary pressure because every user needs to have at least 3 Axies. So there is a huge steep curve of inflationary pressure because of the growing demand of user growth, the growing amount of users. That's internally. Externally, Axie is an importer of ETH. Things are paid in ETH, which adds to the upward pressure on SLP. And this affects the opportunity cost to hold SLPs, which adds to a selling pressure in the market. Okay, this is where we go into economics. So the ambition of growing sustainably is to manage the levers of monetary and fiscal policy expansion and contraction. How does that look like? First, we start with the demand of NFTs. So this is just like in economics, in the real world, you have a demand for domestic goods. So domestic goods is your Axie in the Axie game, because these are your core assets that you need to own before you can engage in the game. So this is where there's an expansionary phase that creates excessive demand for NFTs. An expansionary phase comes from people coming in and huge demand growth and user growth of the system. Then the growing demand of the domestic goods puts an upward pressure on the game currency token. Again, because more demand coming in, more people are demanding the SLP, which is the main currency of trade and exchange in your system. And what does this mean? It means that the relative currency purchasing, this affects the relative currency purchasing power. And it affects the domestic currency strength. And this is something that you can tweak in the currency farming mechanism, because not only are people playing and holding the tokens within the system, they're also providing liquidity in the secondary market of SLP ETH or SLP USDC staking in liquidity pools to allow for secondary market activities. So there are things that you can play around there that's kind of like your foreign exchange monetary policies in your system. And that relative domestic currency strength, as it increases, because more people are demanding it, then the currency will appreciate further, which incentivizes more people coming in, because you're earning fixed amount of SLP. SLP is worth more in USD, more people are coming in. And this increases the participation of gamers. In the physical world, that is where you have increased population growth or increased migration coming into your economy, which is great because then it incentivizes, again, it becomes a circular thing where it increases the amount of user growth and inflates the assets even more than the domestic supply of NFTs, the Axies, start to increase more because there's just more demand. So, and that becomes a cycle. At the same time, so assuming that all of these stays constant, then the demand of NFTs get rebalanced because we can update different kind of parameters of the NFTs or the Axie breeding program. For example, we can instead of breeding 7 times, you can reduce it less so that you can balance the inflation rate as your user growth increases. So there are a lot of levels and tweaks that we can change. It's not just about your fiscal policy of taxation, which you can do by increasing the number of SLPs and AXS you need to burn to create your Axie. You can also change the number of inflationary possibilities, which is your breeding of the Axies. So that is just the general cycle. But let's go down into the key thing that we've been talking about so far, which is value creation. So the Axies economy creates value by having fun gameplay to retain users and to put SLP or AXS for other value creation. So this is where we can understand a little bit more about what Axie wanted versus how the economic policy showed what is implemented. As you know, what the theory or the idea is for a game or an economy doesn't always translate to how it is implemented or what is really being implemented. And I think this is where it's the most crucial for you to think about game design and game economy. So again, when it comes to value, we have value creation, value distribution, value sinks. The key insight is that when it comes to value creation, you've got skills versus participation kind of consideration. When we want to grow the economy, you can just base that on participation to grow user base and to grow the number and to grow the value. But as you start to plateau out, as you start to get too much inflationary pressures of labor, hence users coming in, you need to start balancing it with not just participation-based distribution, but also skill-based value distribution or value creation. That means instead of focusing PvE, you focus PvP because you want more interaction between users and challenges of skills, not just participation. Because just participation, pure participation alone is inflationary pressure without real value generation. Then we talk about value distribution. So value distribution for various assets, SLP, AXS, and the energy, and the EXP, the experience. So these are user growth rates affecting the SLP inflation and Axie breeding. So remember, we talk about monetary policy, very important in token design. These are all these typical monetary policy levers and tools you can use to manage and maintain this economy that we're building. Lastly, the supply of SLP is dependent on the in-game activity. So the way to increase the supply is through user base growth, which are new users, and to reduce it, it will be to burn it to mint new Axies. So in general, they all make sense. So if we plot the value creation, sinks, and distribution into a triangle, then how do we balance between these different key things? So if we match value creation, sinks, and distribution into a triangle, then we can map out, ideally we want to balance all three and be in the middle. And looking at these three forces, we can plot where Axie is. And Axie is closer towards the value creation, the value distribution side of short-term growth than actual balance in the middle. What does that mean? Okay, the most important thing. The most important thing is to balance between these three value forces by managing monetary policy. When we talk about value creation, that is our long-term growth. Again, we care a lot about value creation because it's long-term growth. In long-term growth, we look at increasing the usability of SLP, otherwise it'll be forced to be sold and increases sell pressure, which we don't really want. We want to manage the supply of Axie to support Axie breeding, which increases the utility of SLP. And land. If land is used right, it can spur long-term growth, otherwise it will worsen the economy through extraction-focused incentives like rent extraction by landowners. So they are not very close to value creation, not thinking very much on value creation right now, and in this triangle they're not really close there. So let's look at value distribution. Value distribution is short-term growth. Here we're increasing DAU and the daily active users, and this is done by having, moving to the Ronin chain, having cheaper fees. They're also managing the daily SLP minting, and they're also reducing botting and loopholes. They actually clear a lot of people or clear a lot of wallets who are bots, which is great. And that helps with value distribution. You're distributing your short-term growth to the right users, real users, and users who create value in the game. Then we have value sinks. Value sinks are real actual users' playability. So this is allowing Axies to retire or become unusable to manage the supply of Axies. And this can affect the breeding rate, which affects the utility of SLP. Increasing breeding rates means increasing the utility of SLPs. We also have 3 mint function and 1 burn function of SLP. So we need to start increasing the burn functions, otherwise it's just overinflation. Imagine the government just keeps printing US dollars and not allow you to use US dollars in a lot of ways. Then there'll be oversupply of US dollars and things will just get more expensive. And that's not good. That actually reduces the real purchasing power of regular users like you and me. And lastly, it's to focus, value sinks is where we want to focus on actual gamers, actual players who are there for the gameplay and not there to extract economic value, which is extract the monetary gains. So of all these three, Axie is focusing very much on the short-term growth. And so the risk is that there is recession in Axie's economy, which devalues the actual user's value. So let's just jump very quick to understand the problems and solutions. The problems, they focus on user-based growth. The users are actually more interested in the economics. 50% of people saying they're interested in economics than gameplay, which is only 15% people who are interested in gameplay. And this is not good because you're adversely selecting for people who are not gamers, people who are there just to extract value, and not gamers who are creating value. And growth now is then dependent on short-term metrics like DAU, marketplace volume, and breeding rate, and not actual gameplay and user interaction. So this sounds like a Ponzi, right? If your growth is based on short-term growth and based on users coming in on DAU, then it sounds like a Ponzi because it behaves in a very similar way. But at the end of the day, it's not this is like Ponzi is conflated with growth hacking. When any new app or project starts, you have people coming in and just growing the system. The difference between Ponzi and an actual game is that Ponzi it's only sustainable through new users coming in. With an actual game or actual economy, new users coming in will then stay to create and generate value. That is the difference. And that's why it's very important to think about value generation and value generation in the long run, because that's how we can create a very balanced economy and a healthy growing economy. So what are the solutions? Solutions: increase token utility, reduce token supply, focus on new entrants, focus on long-term value creation. So projects sound like Ponzi scams, but if they are generating value in the long run, then that's not true. Ponzi focuses on short-term value growth or short-term user growth to sustain development, whereas if we shift it towards value creation in the long run, this will be mitigated. And in Axie's case, there is hope in the UGC, the breeding part, the UGC as in land, as well as the rules for governing these assets. That will be key. Maintaining that, managing that will be key. Okay, so there are 3 areas in which we can tune the parameters. A quick one. We have SLP, we have Axie, and we have AXS. With SLP, that is the exchange rate of energy to SLP. We have the exchange rate of EXP to get Axie, which affects your SLP inflation rate. And lastly, it's the balance between PVE versus PVP kind of incentive distribution, which we've talked about already. The second thing is Axie. In Axie, it's affecting the breeding rate, the Axie supply, and the MMR matching. So if we want to focus on PvP instead of PvE, in PvP, we want to be better at matching skill sets MMR of people. So Axie, the little creatures, the fundamental parameters are the growth of user base, which determines the demand of Axies, the supply of Axies in the space, and the breeding rates of Axies. We always go back to first principles, and if Axies are there, then what are the supply and demand factors in which we can tweak and tune different levers to affect the supply and demand rates? The effects of then what are the impacts of the opportunity cost of holding the Axies? It's either to sell it or to cash out, or to use it to breed. And using it to breed will allow us to increase the sinks of SLP, and so it needs to be very attractive for people to want to hold Axies. And lastly is your AXS. The main parameter for AXS is the AXS usage. Right now, the main utility is to use AXS, to stake AXS for governance and to get returns in AXS. So with land, the availability of land, maybe they could potentially use AXS to help with promoting UGC or to help increase the complexity of games. That is very important because when we're talking about value creation, we also want to talk about long-term value generation in the system. So AXS can be used in conjunction with land, and land can be taxed and paid in AXS, for example. Then there are also other utilities that should be thought about to reduce the circulating supply or to create sinks for AXS. So at the end of the day, there's no equilibrium. An economy is a live system. Economics is the internal regulation mechanism to balance between various forces. What are these forces? You go back to first principles to understand the supply and demand forces of the various kind of assets in the space. These assets are not always, or these resources are not always tradable. They could be currencies, they could be individual points like experience and energy points. And how does that impact value creation, which is the utility of these resources? You need to grow them proportionally. You can't grow the outside too fast without growing the inside. You can't also grow the inside too fast without growing the outside. So the summary is that you need to balance them, you need to grow them proportionally, and you need to find ways to balance between value creation, value distribution, and value sinks. So with that is me. I'm Lisa, and I'm the managing director at Economics Design. At Economics Design, we design, measure, and maintain economic policies, both for DeFi and for GameFi. And at the end of the day, this is not an easy task. Building a game is already so difficult, and I'm massively impressed by all of you guys building games because it's a very, very challenging topic and very challenging task. So great stuff, great job that you're doing this. And the way to really exploit the value that can be generated, the fund that can be generated to users will be through proper economics, strong economics, sustainable economics, resilient economics that can go against all these outside forces. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not something that you build and forget about it. It's a constant maintenance and rebalancing. How we maintain, how we balance, you go back to first principles, understand your demand-supply forces, understand economic activities, understand and design and fix economic rules in your system. With that, I look forward to speaking with you guys again soon and just answer all these questions that you have. In the meantime, feel free to check out the report that we have and learn more about the P2E space. Till then, bye!